So now we have the vast majority of our client-side infrastructure put together. What I want to do now is take advantage of that infrastructure and put together a subsystem for displaying dialog boxes. So the idea is there will be an action that can be dispatched by anybody, by any component, or rather by containers, and it will indicate that a dialog box of a particular type needs to be shown to the user. So the first step is I'm going to stub out our login dialog box. Now that'll be the only dialog box that we're going to have, but I wanted to show a couple cool tricks about how we can make a reusable sort of dialog system to present that to the user. Because ultimately, the markup for the dialog box needs to be presented all the way up in the app container. There are packages you can grab off GitHub or NPM that do this for you. That there are React dialog box packages, but I kind of want to keep things as vanilla as possible. Just show that I can show you guys how these things might work behind the scenes. Also, I'm going to remove that console log. I don't know why it's there. In components, I'm going to create a new folder called Dialogs. Inside of Dialogs, I'm going to create login.js and login.scss. In login.js, I'm going to import our login.scss. Then I'm also going to import React from React. I'm going to import star as a from .. actions. Then I'm going to import container base from .. lib container. So the login dialog box is going to be its own container. Then I'm going to say, I'm not going to export this. You'll see why momentarily. I'm going to say class login dialog extends container base. Then I'm going to write a simple render method that'll return a section with the class name of c-login-dialog. We're going to put an h1 in here for login, and then maybe a p tag. Doesn't really matter. Stuff and things. All right, so how are we going to export this? Well, the way that I want to work this out is I want all of these dialogs in this folder to be automatically included by Webpack and put into a data structure that allow us to import that into our application without our application ever knowing that there is such a thing as a login dialog. For that, I'm going to be creating a couple actions and a constant. So let's go ahead and hop into, before we finish this off, let's go ahead and hop into our actions. And I'll put this over here and that over there, go full screen, hide that. And in our actions.js file, now this is our client-side actions. I'm going to put a marker in here, say App Store, and he's going to have an export const dialog set action, which will have an export const dialog set action factory, which will take in an ID, is open, and props, which will default to an empty object, goes into type is going to be dialog set, is open is going to be is open, and props is going to be props. So the idea is that if you want to open up a dialog, you would dispatch the dialog set action with the ID of the dialog you want, whether or not you want it to be open, and the properties you want it to get. So for the ID, we're going to make that as a const. I'm going to say export const dialog_login equals dialog_login. So that's going to be the ID of our login dialog. Then back over to our login component, I'm going to export. I'm simply going to export default, and it's going to be an object that has an ID of a dialog login with the component that'll simply reference login dialog. So that's how, in this project, we only have one dialog, but that's how the app container is going to be made aware of this component. It's going to know that, okay, this is the login dialog, and its component is this guy right here. All right, now for the fun bit. The fun bit is I want to write some code against Webpack that will loop through all of the files, all the JavaScript files in this directory, and package them up and send them off as a single object. So in Dialogs, I'm going to create a file called index. And in index, I'm going to use a feature of Webpack. So remember, this is client components dialogs index is the file we're in. I'm going to use a feature of Webpack called context, not to be confused with React context. I'll say import underscore from Lodash. Then I'm going to say const context equals require.context dot slash comma false, and then a regular expression that'll match dot JS end. What this does is this instructs Webpack to, at build time, not at runtime, at build time, to package up every single file that is in this directory, not including subdirectories, that it ends with .js. So now we can load them up. Now that Webpack has included them all, we can load them. And so to do that, I'm going to say const components equals context, drop down to a new line, dot keys. And what keys is, for the context that's returned by Webpack, it's going to be the ID, the module names for each one of these components. Then I'm going to say dot filter name goes into name.index, or name.index of index equals -1. This will filter out this current file. We don't want this file to include itself. That would be bad. So we filter out the file named index from our keys. Then I say map, name goes into, then I invoke context, this context that was returned by require.context, as a function, and I pass the name of the module into it, which will then at runtime load in that loaded module that was packed because Webpack knows about require.context. This has the effect of a require statement or an import statement, which means to access this default export, I simply do that .default. And now I have an array of all of the files inside of this directory, which exports out an object with an ID and a component property. Now what I want to do is convert that array from something that looks like ID1 comp blah, ID2 comp whoa. I want to convert that into an object that looks like this. All right, so I want to loop through each one of these items and create a new object that has the property IDs and then the component as the value. And we can do that simply with zip object. So I'm going to say export default underscore dot zip object. Zip object can take in two parameters. First one is what all of the IDs of the object are going to be. The second is what the value of the object is going to be. So we'll pass in components.map. C goes into CID. And then components.map. C goes into C.component. And what that'll do is that'll convert this structure, exported by all of these modules, into this structure, which is easily consumable. All right, so that's great. We can now, inside of our app.js file, so take a look at index. I'm going to close this because I'm done with it. And then take a look at login because I'm going to close that. We're done with that for now. And then I'm also going to close actions. Now an app, all I have to do to get all of my potential dialogs is simply come up here and say import dialog types from /dialogs. Now remember, because I'm accessing a directory, Webpack will load in the index.js. But we have a couple problems here. First of all, we're never dispatching the request to open the login dialog. Let's take care of that one first. Let's go into our lobby.js file and scroll down to our sidebar to where we have this login. And And what I'm going to do, actually, the first thing I'm going to do is at the top, I'm going to import star as a from .. actions. So we have our reference to all of our actions. Then, down here in lobby sidebar, in the login function, I'm simply going to say this dot dispatch, and then I'm going to pass in a.dialog set, passing in a dialog ID of a.dialog login and an is open of true, and no props, because we don't need to send any information to our login dialog. And that's it. So at this point, everything is working except for we need to do two more things. We need to actually go into our app store, the store for the application, and write code that will handle this dispatch of dialog set and turn it into an observable sequence. Now that observable sequence is going to spit out an array of all the open dialogues currently in the application. Then the app component is going to register to that observable, and whenever that changes, it'll re-render itself with that array of all the open dialogues. So if we come back here to stores in app.js, let's go ahead and make a constructor. And the constructor is going to take in a object deconstruction of dispatcher. Remember, on all of the stores, the first parameter is this services object to the constructor. And what's the services object? Well, that's made by client.js. That's this services object right here. And what is that? Right now, it's just an object with our dispatcher in it. So I can come back here and I can deconstruct that property right out of that parameter. All right, this is going to look a little funky if you're not so familiar with RxJS. But let's go through it line by line. This dialog is money. Remember, I used the money suffix for anything that's observable. Equals dispatcher dot on money a dialog set. Okay, good so far. We're making an observable sequence that listens to the dialog set event from our dispatcher, which currently is being dispatched by our lobby. Then I'm going to do dot scan. This is where things get weird. Stack, comma, action goes into. Now, before I implement dot scan, I'm going to add at the end, before I forget, comma, empty array. Now, scan, again, I talk all about scan and all about these methods in my RxJS course. If you're interested, I would definitely check that out. But scan, what that does is every time a new value is produced by this observable, the scan function will be invoked. And the scan function has the same signature as a reduce operation. The difference is that scan will immediately dispatch or send out any value that we return from it right when it happens. Whereas reduce will do the same thing except wait until the entire observable sequence is terminated. So what do we want to do here? Well, what are we getting? We're getting action, right? So remember, a reduce, the second parameter to the callback is the value that was sent. And the action, of course, is going to be a result of invoking this dialog set. So it's going to have a type, an is open, and a props. Oh, I totally forgot the ID, didn't I? Whoops. Good thing I came back here. Make sure that you're also adding the ID in as well to the dialog set action factory, because that's the ID of the dialog. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to import Lodash. Then, whenever this action comes in, I'm going to say lodash.remove stack ID action.id. So whether we're opening or closing a dialog, I'm removing it from the array of open dialogues. Then I'm going to say if action.isOpen, then stack.push ID action.id props action.props. So what this has the effect of doing is, let's say we already have a dialog of the same type open, and we get a request to open it again. This will A, push it to the front of the stack, and B, replace the existing props. Then we simply return stack. So stack is just an array, which defaults to an empty array. And as dialogs are opened, it will work appropriately. The final thing we got to do is publish replay. And then I can say this dialog.connect. Now, .connect and publish replay aren't strictly required for this, for the way we'll be using it, but they are important. Basically, I mean, you can look at the docs, or you can go over my RxJS course where I describe in good detail what connectable observables are. But what I'm basically saying is, whoever subscribes to Dialog will always get the same observable sequence as anybody else. If I didn't have publish, that would not be true. Second, whenever someone subscribes, they will get immediately the last value that was published. And then, because this is a connectable observable, I have to manually connect it afterwards. Anyway, check out the docs or my previous course if you want to look that up. But now, how do we consume it? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Come over to app. On component did mount, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subscribe to that observable. I'm going to say const stores :app equals this.context. Then I'm going to say this.subscribe, which doesn't exist yet because we're still inheriting from component. So I'm going to remove that import. Then I'm going to say import container base from /lib component. I believe that's what it's called, yep. And then I'm going to call this component base, or container base. Then on subscribe, on component did mount, I'll say on subscribe, this.subscribe, passing in my observable, which is app.dialogs, money. Then I'm going to say dialogs goes into this set state dialogs. So now, whenever this observable updates, this.setState is called on the app container, and we get a new render with a new value of dialogs. All right, let's go ahead and see if that's working. I'm going to simply console log this state dialogs. I'm going to save that out. And we should now see our dialogs getting added as we click the login button, at least in the console. So let's come over here and refresh. Jump over to our console. Cannot read property dialogs of null. This state dialogs. Whoops, that's because this states. So this dot state and this state dialogs. Okay, so now I can hit login and check that out. Dialogs is now an array of one object that has the ID of dialog login and the props of nothing. And if I go into the React thing, the React tools, I can look at app container and look at the state. Let's do that again. Go to route container, app container. The state is empty right now, but the second I hit login, the state turns into a object with dialogs of array of 1. All right, so I think that wraps this up, and the next video we'll actually go ahead and finish this implementation of dialogs off. And we'll see you guys then.